you overwhelmed by all of the scales that you need to learn to improvise jazz? With potentially hundreds of jazz scales that you can use to improvise, many students end up quitting because it's just way too much to think about. However, as a pro pianist, when I improvise, I actually have 10 go-to scales that I use 99% of the time, and they sound amazing. I consider these the most important scales, and if you want to get a pro sound when you improvise, you really need to know these scales. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you these scales, plus how you can improvise with them, and at the end of this lesson, improvising at the piano is going to be easier than ever. All right, we're going to start with scale number 10 and work our way to the number 1 scale, so make sure to watch all the way to the end if you want to learn my favorite scale for improvising over almost any tune, plus it works over tons of chords. All right, scale number 10 is what I call the magic scale, and it has a super cool sound. Give it a listen. So this scale is really cool because you can use it on major chords. So if you take a C major and you want to improvise in a more interesting way than just using your C scale, you can use this other scale. It's called C Lydian. And basically it's like a C major scale, except you're going to raise that F to an F sharp. Okay, it's called C Lydian. And this works on basically any major chord, so C major, or in jazz if you have a C major 7, or jazzier chords like a C major 9 or a C6 9, you can use this C Lydian scale over all of these chords. It also works on major chords where you might have a sharp 11 in this chord. So a sharp 11 just means F sharp. And so if you see like a major chord with a sharp 11, you can use the C Lydian scale. Also, it works on polychords. A polychord is a chord on top of another chord. So if you have a D major over a C major, well, you can use the C Lydian scale to improvise over this polychord. Now there's a very simple trick to remembering this scale, and this is what I use if I want to remember a Lydian scale. It's basically a C major 7 chord and a D major chord combined. So this really simplifies it. Instead of thinking of 7 notes, I just think of a chord, C major 7, and another chord, D major. And another cool trick is when you're improvising with C Lydian, you can actually use these 2 chord shapes in your improvisation. You see that? I'm just using these 2 chords. All right, before I show you the next scale, if you're enjoying this lesson, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe for more videos just like this. All right, scale number 9 is also a scale you can use on major chords. It sounds super cool. Give it a listen. I call this the major rub scale because you may have noticed when I was improvising, I added this kind of colorful note, G sharp. And so the technical name of the scale is called the major bebop scale. It's actually used in a lot of bebop music, and it's a simple scale where you take your major scale and you add a G sharp to it, okay? And so you can use this scale on any major chord like C major or C major 7 or C major 9, C6 9. These are all scales that are used in jazz. Now another chord you can use this scale on would be an augmented chord. So if you have a C augmented or C sharp 5, you can use this scale right on an augmented chord. Now there's a really simple trick to remembering this scale. It is simply a C major scale and you add a sharp 5 to it. By the way, you can download and print the sheet music for this lesson. This lesson also comes with 5 downloadable backing tracks where you can practice improvising with these scales with a band. So I'll put a link to the backing tracks and the sheet music below. Scale number 8 is what I call the happy sad scale. It is a super cool scale and it works on minor chords. Give it a listen. The reason I call this a happy sad scale is because it uses happy notes and sad notes. And so here's what I mean. If you take a C minor chord and you play these 7 notes over it, you get kind of like a minor scale, like this is called the C natural minor scale, but you also get this A, which comes from the major scale. So you get kind of a happy note, but then you get kind of 2 sad notes, okay? The name of the scale is called the C Dorian scale, and it works on almost any minor chord. C minor 7, C minor 9, C minor 11, C minor 6, 9. These are all chords you're going to see in jazz, and so this is one of my go-to scales, C Dorian scale. Now, there's a very simple trick to remembering this scale, and it's simply an F7 chord, that's a dominant 7 chord, and a G minor. Okay? Basically, all of the notes of C Dorian are included in these 2 chords. So when you're improvising, you can actually improvise around these 2 chord shapes. Scale number 7 is what I call the minor rub scale, and it sounds like this. Now, I call this the minor rub because it has a really cool rub note. And when I was improvising, you may have noticed I was adding this little B to my improv. So this scale is basically a C Dorian scale, but I'm gonna add a B natural to this scale, and it gives me a really cool sound. Right? It has a nice sound to it. So this scale works on any minor chord like C minor or C minor 7, C minor 9, C minor 11, C minor 6, 9. It also works on the SPI chord. This is the SPI chord. It's called C minor major 7. Now, a simple way to remember this scale is that it is simply a C minor 7 and a D minor 6, meaning all of the notes of the scale are encompassed in these 2 chords, C minor 7, D minor 6. So this is the way that I recommend that you think of this scale. It's the way that I think of this scale, and it makes it a lot easier to remember the notes. By the way, if you want to learn more about soloing and the best scales to use, we have put together the full learning track. This will teach you everything that you need to know about jazz soloing. And so if you go to our learning tracks level 2, you scroll down to skills. We've got these learning tracks where you can learn different skills, and you're going to want to go down here to soloing fundamentals or soloing in styles. In soloing fundamentals, you'll learn pretty much everything you need to know about jazz soloing. I go over every scale that you need to know in detail. We teach you exercises, we teach you how to use them over chord progressions, how to connect various scales, and you really do a deep dive on each scale so you truly understand that scale and how to use it over different tunes. So I'll put a link to both of those learning tracks below. All right, scale number 6 is what I call the Jazzy-Blues Scale, and it has a very hip sound. Check it out. Now, I call this the Jazzy-Blues Scale because it has blues in it, and it's also used over tons of jazz tunes. And so it kind of combines the best of both worlds. It's not your blues scale, but it's not like a very obscure jazz scale. It kind of fuses, I think, the best of blues and jazz. So what is this scale? Well, the scale uses these 7 notes. It's a lot like a C major scale with a B flat, and it's used over dominant 7th chords. So these are chords you'll see in the blues, you'll see it in jazz, and it's a very common chord in jazz tunes. So you can use this on a C7, on a C9, you can use it even on a C13. These are all dominant chords. And you can use this on sus chords. So if you have a C7 sus4 or C9 sus4, it also works on these chords. Now, the simple trick to remembering this scale is that it is simply a C7 chord and a D minor chord. And so this hits all of the notes of this scale. And by the way, I don't think I told you the technical name of this scale. It's called the Mixolydian scale, but I like to call it the Jazzy-Blues Scale. All right, scale number 5 is one of my all-time favorite scales. I use it probably 80% of my playing. So this is honestly one of the most important scales. Pay attention to this scale. And I'm going to play it inside of a chord progression so you really can appreciate the scale. This scale is truly amazing because it is so versatile, and in just a minute I'm going to show you how actually this one scale works over 4 different chords. So it is a very efficient scale. In other words, you don't need to learn a lot of scales to get a lot of bang for your buck. So what is the scale? Well, we're going to start on C, and we're going to go half step, whole step up the piano. So half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. It's a weird looking scale. Give that a look. This is called your dominant diminished scale. And this works over dominant seventh chords, like a C7 chord, if you want a really hip sound, meaning you want a very jazzy sound, you want a lot of color, and you want a lot of rub to your improvisation. This is the go-to scale. And so this works anytime you're on a chord like C7 and you want to improvise over it. It also works really well on a C7 chord with an altered note. So if you saw C7 flat 9, or C7 sharp 9, or C7 sharp 11, which is also called a flat 5, this scale actually hits all of those notes. So it works really well over these altered chords. Now, as I mentioned, the simple trick to remembering the scale is that it is simply a half whole scale coming up the piano. And I also mentioned that this works on 4 different dominant chords, meaning if you played an E flat 7 and you started on this note and you go half whole, half whole, half whole, guess what? It's the same scale. And if you play the same scale on a G flat 7 and you go half whole, half whole, half whole, guess what? It's the same scale. And if you play it over an A7 and you go half whole, all the way up the piano, it's the same scale. So moral of the story, if you want to sound like a pro jazz pianist, learn your dominant diminished scale. Again, I use it so much of the time, almost anytime you see a dominant chord, and it sounds awesome. Scale number 4 is what I call the angular scale. And if you really want like a dark sound to your improv and you want to hit a lot of really cool kind of rub notes, this is one of the most altered sounding scales that you can play. Here's what it sounds like, and once again, I'll play it in the context of a chord progression. So what's happening here is I'm playing a C7 chord, but I'm going for the maximum number of altered notes, meaning I want the crunchiest sound. And so with this scale, it's a lot like that dominant diminished scale that I taught you earlier, except instead of playing the G and the A, we're gonna play a simple A flat, okay? And so we're gonna use this on a C7 chord. You would typically play this in the context of F major. So if I was on a 5 chord and I was going to a 1 chord, I might use this scale to resolve to my F major chord. Now the technical name of this scale is the altered scale, and it works over dominant 7th chords, but in particular it works over dominant 7th chords that have your altered notes like flat 9, sharp 11, and or flat 13. So anytime you have a dominant 7th chord, and especially if that 7th chord calls for 1 or more altered notes, you can usually use this altered scale to improvise over it, and it sounds great. Now the special trick to remembering this scale is that it uses the first 3 notes of your C dominant diminished, and then it uses E whole tone, okay? And so this creates the full scale. All right, scale number 3 is what I call the Angsty Scale, and it has a lot of angst in it. Here's what it sounds like. Now you might be thinking, Johnny, that did not sound very angsty. That actually sounded quite beautiful. And you're right, the way I played it was over this beautiful jazz ballad. But if you look at this scale, that's the scale that I just played. It is a quite angsty scale because it has all these minor third intervals. Minor third, minor third, minor third, and then minor third, minor third, minor third. And so when you combine all of these minor intervals, you get this really cool scale called your diminished scale, okay? And so this actually works on diminished chords. Like if you had a C diminished 7, you can use this scale, okay? And diminished chords are not super common in jazz, but you'll occasionally see them, especially on a flat 3 chord. So if you're in the key of C, sometimes you'll see like an E flat diminished drop in to a D minor 7. And so an E flat diminished is the same as a C diminished. So on this E flat diminished, you can use this C diminished scale. Now the simple trick to remembering this scale is that you can think of it as 2 diminished 7th chords. So a C diminished 7th is all minor intervals, and then also a D diminished 7 has all minor intervals, and if you combine them, C diminished, D diminished, you end up with this scale. It's also a whole half scale. So whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. All right, scale number 2 is what I call the mystery sad scale, and here's what it sounds like. This scale is super cool because it obviously has a very sad sound, but it also has this mysterious sound to it. So what scale am I playing? Well, we're gonna start on C, and we're gonna play these 7 notes. Okay, well, what the heck is this scale? This is called the half diminished scale, and you would typically use this scale on half diminished chords or minor 7 flat 5 chords. Now you're probably thinking, where am I going to see this chord, Johnny? Well, you'll typically see it on a minor tune, and you'll typically see it on the 2 chord. So you might see a C half diminished 7th chord in the key of B flat. Right? If you're in the key of like B flat minor, you might go to a 2 chord and play this. And so this is a great scale you can use to improvise over this chord. Now the simple trick to remembering this scale is that it is the 7th mode of D flat, and you have a raised 2. Okay, so here's what this means. If you take your D flat major scale, right, and you take the 7th note, the C, and you play the same scale starting on C, okay, then you just raise the 2nd note, the D flat, up to the D natural, and you have your C half diminished. All right, drum roll for scale number 1. Are you ready for this? I think this is the most important scale if you want to play jazz, and the reason I think this is the most important scale is because you can use it on so many chords, meaning you can take one scale and play it over an entire chord progression and it sounds great. I call it the universal scale not only because you can use it on tons of chords in a chord progression, but it is also used across tons of genres. It's used in jazz, blues, funk, pop, rock, and I'm going to show you what it sounds like if you were to use this scale to improvise over the tune Georgia. When I was just improvising, I played a bunch of different chords. I played a C7, I played an E7, I played an A minor 7, I played an F sharp, minor 7 flat 5, lots of chords, except the majority of the time I used this one scale, and I think it actually sounded really nice. So what are the notes of this scale? Well, it is actually a 9-note scale, and it uses these notes. Okay, you see this one? There are a lot of notes here, but it actually combines 2 different blues scales into one scale. So if you take your minor blues scale, that's C minor blues, and if you take your major blues scale, that's C major blues, and you smash them together, you end up with this scale called your mixo blues scale. Now you're probably thinking, Johnny, why do you call it a mixo blues scale? Well, it's actually the Mixolydian scale that I taught you earlier combined with your minor blues scale. And so that's another name for the scale. You can actually think of it as a mixo scale combined with your blues scale, or you can think of it as your minor and major blues scales combined, okay? So this works on 7th chords like C7, and once again, it works on tons of other chords. So if you're playing a tune in the key of C and you're encountering other chords like F or G or your 2 chord D, or even dominant chords like D7 or A7, there's a very good chance that this scale will work over those chords. Hey, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the lesson, please leave a comment. Also, if you want us to cover other topics like this, leave a comment, let us know. We're always reading our user comments. And also be sure to check out pianowithjohnny.com. We have the full learning curriculum if you want to play jazz, blues, or almost any style. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.